Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvina Vaditamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May the Divine Being look over us lovingly as a mother and father. May the Divine Being support and nourish us as a mother and father. May we have the strength and skill to study together the art of spirituality. May no misunderstandings arise amongst us. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all beloved beings everywhere. Very much so to those who are with us this morning. Good morning, namaste. We are studying Swami Prabhavananda's book, How to Know God. We are in chapter 1, the aim of yoga, and we have come to sutra number 5. But I'm going to read Sutra 4 first, simply because it's kind of amusing, because it describes the state we're in right now. At times when a person is not in the state of yoga, that person remains identified with the thought waves in the mind. We're identified with the thought waves in our minds, aren't we? That's what we're experiencing right now. So when we're not in the state of yoga, we are identified with the thought waves in the mind. And it is the aim of yoga to break this identification with the thought waves in the mind and with the body itself. So, Sutra number 5. There are 5 kinds of thought waves, some painful, others not painful. There are 5 kinds of thought waves, some painful, others not painful. Now, why is Patanjali describing the thought waves of the mind? Because he is a scientist and because he wants us to be aware that we are not alone with this, that what we experience as these painful and others not painful thought waves are very much shared by others. Each of us in our own way, of course, our unique way, but nevertheless, as a scientist, Patanjali is classifying the thought waves of the mind. So the Swami writes, a painful wave, according to Patanjali's use of the term, is not necessarily a wave which seems painful when it first arises in the mind. It is a wave which brings with it an increased degree of ignorance, addiction, and bondage. So that's the definition of a painful thought wave. A thought wave which brings with it in an increased degree of ignorance, addiction, and bondage. Well, we can all think about our own thought waves and think about those that don't seem painful, but they do keep us hooked into the world of thought waves and sense pleasures and so on, which is bondage. Similarly, a wave which seems painful at first may actually belong to the category of those which are not painful, provided that it impels the mind toward greater freedom and knowledge. So the definition of painful is one that produces increased ignorance, addiction, and bondage. The definition of a not painful thought wave is one that impels the mind toward greater freedom and knowledge. For example, Patanjali would describe a lustful thought wave as painful because lust, even when pleasantly satisfied, causes addiction, jealousy, and bondage to the person desired. A wave of pity, on the other hand, would be described as not painful because pity is an unselfish emotion which loosens the bonds of our own egotism. So before we go on, any comments from your own wisdom or experience, or any concerns or questions that you might want to raise about these definitions of what is a painful and not painful thought wave? Just to review, a painful thought wave is one that is said to increase our ignorance or maintain our level of ignorance and or increase our addiction and therefore our bondage. A not painful thought wave is one that impels the mind toward greater freedom and knowledge. Are there any thoughts or concerns or questions regarding this? Because this is foundational to what Patanjali is going to go on and describe about how to relieve ourselves of painful thought waves and therefore ignorance, addiction, and bondage, and how to cultivate not painful thought waves that increase our freedom and knowledge. Anything at all from you?
Yeah, so just a point of clarification, this thought waves that we are talking about in the 5th sutra, is it the same thought waves in the 2nd sutra, which is really saying where the aim is to have cessation of those thought waves?
Control of them or cessation, yes. Cessation. But ultimately, the goal is cessation of both the painful and the not painful thought waves. No vibration in the mind stuff at all. No vrittis in the mind stuff or citta. Anything else from anyone? Good question. Good clarification.
Ravi Shankara, this reminds me of there's a term called Shreyas and Preyas.
Yes.
Yeah, the Shreyas is like when you like anything you do towards the real knowledge, and Preyas is when you are doing towards the pleasure. So Preyas is when you do for what is pleasing, and Shreyas is what you do, what you truly desire. So,
yes, well, it's Swami Prabhavananda translates those words as the good, Shreyas, and the pleasant, Preyas. So we'll find as we go along that he uses the words, you are to choose, if you are to pursue this path, you are to choose the good over the pleasant.
Yeah.
Thank you, Somesh. Anything else from anyone? Okay. So, cultivating unselfish emotions loosens the bonds of our egotism. And as we'll find when we go into the yamas and niyamas, that is exactly what Patanjali teaches. How to restrain those selfish thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and how to cultivate, how to replace those with those which loosen the bonds of our egotism. We may suffer deeply when we see others suffering, but our pity will teach us understanding and hence freedom. So we may suffer deeply when we see others suffering. That's an emotion. We may be empathetic, but our pity will teach us understanding and hence freedom. Greater understanding equals greater freedom. The distinction between the two kinds of thought waves is very important when we come to the actual practice of yoga discipline. For the thought waves cannot be controlled at once. First, we have to overcome the painful thought waves by raising waves that are not painful. To our thoughts of anger, desire, and delusion, we must oppose thoughts of love, generosity, and truth. I'll repeat that. We have to overcome the painful thought waves by raising waves which are not painful. We have to, if we're going to pursue this path, we have to overcome the painful thought waves by raising waves which are not painful. To our thoughts of anger, desire, and delusion, we must oppose thoughts of love, generosity, and truth. Only much later, when the painful thought waves have been completely stilled, can we proceed to the second stage of discipline, the stilling of the not painful waves, which we have deliberately created. The idea that we should ultimately have to overcome even the thought waves which are good, pure, and truthful may at first seem shocking to a student who has been trained in the Western approach to morality. But a little reflection will show him that this must be so. The external world, even in its most beautiful appearances and noblest manifestations, is still superficial and transient. It is not the basic reality, capital R. We must look through it, not at it, in order to see the Atman. So once again, since we're building blocks and building blocks here, any comments, thoughts, wisdom to offer, questions, anything at all about what's been said? All right. Certainly it is better to love than to hate, better to share than to hoard, better to tell the truth than to lie. But the thought waves which motivate the practice of these virtues are nevertheless disturbances in the mind. We all know instances of admirable, earnest men who become so deeply involved in the cares of the great reform movement or who become so deeply involved in the cares of a great reform movement or social relief project that they cannot think of anything beyond the practical problems of their daily work. Their minds are not calm. They are full of anxiety and restlessness. The mind of the truly illumined man is calm, not because he is selfishly indifferent to the needs of others, but because he knows the peace of the Atman within all things, even within the appearance of misery, disease, strife, and want. So I've said and we'll say again tomorrow in much more detail. To be a spiritual aspirant means being able to hold two thoughts in mind at the same time. Our current belief system, the way we currently think and therefore speak and act, and the ideal, so that we can compare. Meditation isn't just something that you do sitting on the cushion morning and evening. Meditation becomes something that you do all day long. It's called manana, bringing things into the mind in this contemplative sense. So holding two thoughts in mind at the same time. There's no sense denying that we believe in the way we currently think, speak, and act. We've learned to cope with the world by thinking, speaking, and acting in a certain way. But as spiritual aspirants, we are understanding that that is a form of limitation and bondage. It's, in a sense, practical, but it is not ultimately freeing. So we hold at the same time this second thought, the ideal, so that we're constantly looking at the results of the way we currently think, speak, and act, and comparing those with what we are told are the results of this higher thought. Most people, and this is not a judgment or an accusation, it's just simply an observation of fact. Most people are not capable of this. We must, as spiritual aspirants, this is not dogma. It isn't something that you must do, period. No. if you want to pursue the path toward greater freedom and happiness, then there is this imperative to be able to hold these two frames of reference in mind at the same time. So any comments or questions about that before we go on to the next sutra?
Yeah, I want to go back to the middle of 2 paragraphs back. The last sentence we have, we may suffer deeply when we see others suffering, but our pity will teach us understanding and hence freedom. And I'm trying to understand what is this saying to me in the context of painful versus not painful thought waves?
The definition of the not painful thought waves is one that lead to greater knowledge and freedom. When we are in a state of empathy or pity, somebody's got their mic open. We're hearing.
Sumesh Batra.
Sumesh, it looks like you've got your
Got it.
mic.
It's
Okay.
still.
Okay. So when we generate thought waves of empathy, what happens when we have these feelings of empathy and compassion for others? We sense, as the Swami said, a loosening of our egoistic self-centeredness. We begin to identify with the other and understand, the understanding comes that that other and myself, we're in this together. The reason we have that feeling is, in fact, there is one, only one. And yes, that one is all in this together. All of these people that are on the screen right now, in fact, there is only one Atman, but we don't know that at this point. That is an ideal that we're holding. So as we loosen the grip of self-centeredness, we sense greater freedom. And so we then have the knowledge that in this direction is greater freedom and happiness. Does that get it?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that.
Okay.
I did want to, I don't want to hog up the time, but I did want to go back to a comment you made that you're going to talk about tomorrow. And it seems like you're talking that there's going to be 2 threads of thoughts. One is whatever we are thinking as we are, and another one that is probably what should be the non-painful or the ideal type of thought. Is there a third thread? Meaning,
well, yes, going beyond them both. As Swami Vivekananda pointed out, fetters, though of gold, are not less strong to bind. Even the highest spiritual and practical thoughts that we can have. So what we're going to be talking about tomorrow is the approach of the Advaitist or Jnana Yogi. Here today we're talking about the approach of the Raja Yogi. But the goal is the same, to go beyond both the painful and the not painful, to go beyond all lower K knowledge, no matter how high that knowledge is, no matter how much it is avidya, it is still avidya maya. So the goal is to go beyond maya, to be free from the grip of the gunas. So tomorrow we're going to talk about how Vivekananda approaches that, how Ramana Maharshi talks about that, how Nisargadatta Maharaj talks about that, and how a quantum physicist by the name of David Bohm, who became a convicted Advaitist, came to think of that from his perspective as a quantum physicist.
Thank you.
Brother Shankara,
Yes, dear.
I have questions with two concrete sort of examples. One is, we are taking care of our aged mother-in-law with her physical and mental issues, doing the best we can.
Yes.
But sometimes it's very painful to watch somebody go through so many issues. And there's only so much we can do, but it's still, for us, it's very painful. So sometimes I have tried that, where I tell myself that her Atman is at peace, it's just her body suffering. And it does help me to kind of decrease the amplitude of my pain. The other, on the flip side, we have friends whose children consider us grandparents, so they call us every night and read stories, and so that's a very happy and joyous feeling. So in that case, also thinking that, how do I get to the Atman so I don't get overboard with that joy or with that pleasure?
Well, you've already identified it as potentially painful. Because if you get addicted to it, if you get to where you seek that and wait for it, and then this is a form of bondage. The love of these children who regard you as grandparents, clearly that's a higher form of bondage. And some people are just content to live within that form of bondage. It is, I call that the grandparent trap. Now, as far as the first goes, with regard to your mother-in-law and her terrible suffering, which I know of because I've spoken to both you and Naveen about it, your empathy, and therefore the pain that you feel, is a kind of austerity as you empathize with her. And so you sacrifice that austerity by reminding yourself of the higher truth that behind all of this appearance is the Atman. That's a very good way to decrease your bondage by exercising this thought of knowledge, which gives you greater freedom and therefore lessens the pain of your austerity. It is an austerity to care for others, particularly when they are suffering. So you bravo for what you described about your recourse to the thought of the Atman with regard to her and your relationship with her. And I just say, you're already aware of the danger, the pain that can be associated with this relationship with dear children. They're going to grow up. And when they do, they cease seeking you, and they, in fact, sometimes just flat ignore you. And then what? Then what was pleasurable becomes painful. Anything else from anyone? Very, very
Thank
good.
you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hari Om, Shankaraji, this is Balakrishna. I just
Yes,
think,
Bala.
Swayam is going through all this, but also the children are reading these stories. You have to start thinking you are doing a karma yoga in the sense you are giving happiness for those children to read. And if you start thinking that way, you are not binding yourself. I don't know, this is my thought.
Very good, Bala. It is good to share with children and to give them this sense that there are people in the world that truly and unconditionally love them, and that they can trust you entirely. This is such an absolute refuge for children, particularly as they grow up and the world begins to beat them up. That's why in their 20s, they oftentimes return to us. Oh, you gave me so much when I was just little. In the meantime, they're growing up, and it's us that suffers from the fact that we got addicted to that relationship with them. Thank you, Bala. If you can see things in terms of karma yoga, yet another yoga perspective.
I just want to add to what Bala just said. I think the example was that it's good karma, but to really reach the pinnacle of karma yogi, you actually have to take the fruits of the action and put it and devote it to God, which is karma phala kalpa tyaga. So tyaga is or karma shankalpa tyaga. So you have to take it one more step beyond. What you're doing is good karma. But in order to not get the bondage, you have to take the fruits and put it in, on the altars of God.
And further, that's the living sacramentally part. Yeah, absolutely, thank you. The other part is to understand that you are not the doer. And therefore, if you are not the doer, there's no reason whatsoever for you to become attached to anything. And therein lies the great freedom. As you said, living sacramentally, offering it all on the altar as penance. But then the other is taking whatever happens as prasad. And then when the children get into their teen years and seem to no longer want to know your name, then it's not as painful. Thank you both, Bala and yourself. Anything else from anyone? This is exactly what we should be doing here. This is what it means to have a class, to go through and make these things real for us by doing the manana together. Thank you. Anyone else?
The only thing that reminded me the last sentences.
Yes.
It knows the peace of the Atma. This is what Ramakrishna, when he was so much of pain, he was talking to Swami Trigunathitananda, and he says, oh, I have so much of pain. And he said, oh, I just saw you. You're in such a bliss. Why do you complain? Then he says, oh, the rascal found me.
Yes. Well, that's it. All right. So Patanjali in Sutra 6 of chapter 1 continues with his scientific analysis of thought waves. These 5 kinds of thought waves are right knowledge, wrong knowledge, verbal delusion, sleep, and memory. So I'll repeat that. These 5 kinds of thought waves are right knowledge, wrong knowledge, verbal delusion, sleep, and memory. Sutra 7. The right kinds of knowledge are direct perception, inference, and scriptural testimony. The right kinds of knowledge are direct perception, inference, and scriptural testimony. Whatever our senses perceive is right knowledge, provided that there has been no element of delusion. No element of delusion. Whatever we infer from our direct perception is also right knowledge, provided that our reasoning is correct. Now, we can see in the lives of people that we know that though their senses are functioning correctly, what they make of what they perceive is incorrect. We think of this as forms of mental illness. So this is what's being gestured to here.
Brother Sankara,
Yes.
I have a hard time understanding how we're supposed to know if it's right or if it's just the snake or the rope. I mean, who decides if it's right or not? Are we supposed to have that discretion to know?
Well, first of all, the Swami is going to go on and explain, but let me just answer your question this way. As long as we do not know our true self, the coiled rope will appear to us to be a snake. As long as we do not have the knowledge of that which is creating the superimposition of snake on a coiled rope, we will continue to see the snake on the rope, and we will continue to react in that fashion. It is only when we understand that that metaphor is a metaphor for everything we're doing. All of Maya is the superimposition of the snake on the rope. And this is why ultimately we learn to still all the thought waves. Because we can react very appropriately to there being a snake, or we can react inappropriately and say, it's a snake, it bit me. I mean, people will say that. and they believe it. This is wrong reasoning. So it's not a question of deciding so much as it is rising above by, and this is why it's such a long, slow process. Does that answer the question for the time being, or is there more?
Thank you.
You're most welcome. Anything else from anyone? We can know intellectually. This is what I mean by holding two thoughts at the same time. We can know intellectually, I am making a snake out of that rope. At the same time, seeing the snake. The one is the higher knowledge. It first is intellectual knowledge, and it impels us, as the Swami says. It impels our mind toward a frame of reference that is higher and higher, to where the rope snake whole thing begins to seem dreamlike, even though we're still living within Maya. It becomes dreamlike. It loses its, as Sri Ramakrishna puts it, it loses its substantiality. It becomes insubstantial, like a dream, he says. And he says this is true of everything within Maya, even the highest forms of avidya, of avidya Maya, even the highest forms of vidya Maya. So ultimately, there is a great silence within us that is filled with the truth. We can only access that great silence by learning to still all the noise. First, the bad noise, that which promotes more bondage, more addiction, more delusion. Okay? Anything else from anyone? Thank you for that.
Well, instructor,
Yes, Robert.
could you give me a description of what you calling bad knowledge?
Yeah, something that leads to greater addiction, greater bondage, greater anything that leads you in the direction of staying attached to the body, the five organs of action, the five organs of perception, and the lower mind, that which seeks what we can just generalize as animal pleasures. Does that get it?
Well, I wouldn't call that knowledge. I would call that ignorance. So
Well,
I don't know what bad knowledge is. I have never heard or never thought of it. Bad knowledge is every knowledge that I ever know of is good.
Bad knowledge is
If
not.
if it's not good, then it's ignorance. It's not knowledge.
Well, as Jyoti just pointed out, they don't say bad knowledge, they say wrong knowledge.
Well, wrong. That's what I mean. Either one.
Well,
wrong.
there are people who tell you, there are people who tell you that the way to freedom is to be a good moral person. And to avoid immorality and all of the social evils. That's wrong knowledge.
That's again, that's ignorance. That's not knowledge.
Well,
Knowledge. The word.
you're just talking about the flip side of the same coin, Robert. Okay, it's ignorance, but
Yes, but if you refer to it as knowledge, then you're misleading your audience, because that is not knowledge. Is a progression, a positive progression.
yes, as Swami Vivekananda says, we do not move from error to truth. We move from lower truth to higher truth. That lower truth is a form of knowledge.
Brother Shankara?
Yes, please.
Hi. If I may chime in, my understanding of ignorance is not stupidity or wrong knowledge, it is not knowing. So for example, if there is a country that I have never been to, I am ignorant to that country. It doesn't mean I'm stupid or I have wrong knowledge of that country. I am just ignorant. I have no information on it. If I say something about that country that is wrong or not true, that could be misinformation or wrong knowledge. Or if somebody tells me something about that country that is not true, and I am ignorant to that information, I don't know better, then I may have wrong knowledge. So I find a difference between wrong knowledge and ignorance. That's how I understand the two.
Well, very good, Frank. That's very articulately said. For the purposes of this study, everything within Maya, everything that we can know or perceive, is a form of ignorance. It's just the definition that's being used here. It's not in any way disagreeing with you or saying that you're wrong. It's just a different way of talking about it. But everything, ultimately, even the higher forms of knowledge, this is why Vivekananda said, fetters, though of gold, are not less strong to bind. We must be free of thinking, free of any vibration in the mind stuff. Any vibration in the mind stuff, by the terms of the book we're studying and the frame of reference it comes from, is a kind of ignorance. And there's wronger knowledge than there's some very wrong knowledge, as was just described. Whatever our senses perceive is right knowledge, provided that there has been no element of delusion. In other words, taking drugs or some other form of mental illness that creates hallucinations. Whatever we infer from our direct perception is also right knowledge, provided that our reasoning is correct. The scriptures are based upon the superconscious knowledge obtained by great spiritual teachers, which in the state while in the state of perfect yoga. The scriptures are based upon the superconscious knowledge obtained by great spiritual teachers while in the state of perfect yoga. Therefore, they also are right knowledge. They represent a kind of direct perception, far more immediate than the perceptions of the senses, and the truths they teach can be verified by anyone who attains this superconscious vision. And that's what I meant in answer to the lady's question. How do we know? Well, as St. Catherine of Siena wrote, we know nothing until we know everything.
And when Patanjali talks about the painful thought waves, would like an example of that be thinking of something you did, a mistake you've made, which caused great pain, and reflecting on it? Would that be a painful thought wave?
Well, it certainly would be a painful thought wave because it is an absolute 100%. And unless you feel like you haven't learned the lessons associated with those experiences, then it's a 100% waste of time to brood on past mistakes. I mean, if you caused pain to others and you've already done your best to make amends for that, then there's no sense thinking about it any further. So it would be definitely described as a painful thought wave. And anybody who's experienced brooding on past mistakes know that it's painful. One of the reasons it's painful is that there is a deep sense within ourselves, though we may be ignoring it, that we're just wasting our time. Anything more along that line, Brahmadas? That was a very good.
No, it is something I struggle with, and it's right here.
Well,
in this book.
Dear heart, we all struggle with it.
Yeah.
We all, any one of us who becomes introspective, finds these things coming up during our contemplation, concentration, and practice of meditation.
Yes, they do come up. Yes,
So
during
they
meditations.
come up,
Yes.
and you know, this is a quote from Nisargadatta Maharaj. You just have to learn to ignore them.
Right. You mentioned drugs earlier. I think that's one of the reasons people turn to drugs is because you forget about all that for a little bit.
Well, yeah, self-medication with drugs and alcohol and sex and any kind of addiction and it can be a mild addiction. It doesn't have to. You don't have to be a full-out drug addict or a full-out alcoholic to be using recreational drugs and alcohol as self-medication. It just keeps you from, some people are addicted to the television.
Yep.
That's how they keep from thinking.
Yes. Brother Shankara.
Yes, dear.
I think to me, bad habit, some mild addiction would be equivalent to a bad habit, but addiction seems too strong. But everybody has some bad habits. It could be a bad habit of, like I have a bad habit of leaving the water on while I'm brushing my teeth. And no matter, or, there's so many other small bad habits that everybody has. So I don't know if I have to call that addiction or it's just a bad habit that you can overcome by having a good habit of being mindful of not to leave the water on.
Being mindful, yes. Well, mindfulness is the way that mindfulness is one way of translating the word manana. Thinking about the way we currently think, act, and behave, the way we currently think, speak, and behave, versus a higher ideal. And certainly bad habits, or samskaras for various things are part of that. Sometimes they turn into addictions.
And the bad habit of brooding over past mistakes, that is a samskara, isn't it?
Oh, well, yes, first of all, but everything that arises in our mind is a samskara. Everything that we can know or perceive is the result of a samskara. If we encounter something that we have no samskara for, we don't recognize it. We don't know what it is. We may not even see it. It is our knowledge of name and form that allows us to do this. So it's very close to the hour.
Brother Shankara?
Yes, dear.
I was thinking that a combination of Shraddha and sacramental living will help us progress as we offer everything, good and bad, to God, but it doesn't ring true because we are not there yet. But if we then have Shraddha, that the yogis in the state of super consciousness have said so, that there is only one, and then everything is done by that one, then it does, I think, help in making some progress.
Oh, absolutely. You've jumped tracks in a way, Swayam, by bringing in karma yoga, but it was brought in before, so it's been part of the conversation. We're studying Raja Yoga, and Patanjali's workbook, his prescription of 6 steps. You may say, well, wait a minute, there are 8 limbs of yoga. Yes, but the 6 steps, the first 6 limbs, are those that involve self-effort. Having achieved what is to be achieved by those 6 steps, then Patanjali says what is represented by limbs 7 and 8 may happen to you, but it is no longer a result of self-effort. It's beyond the small self that is making efforts. And that is samadhi and liberation. Those are the 7th and 8th steps.
Thank you.
But yes, living sacramentally, living in that way, and offering everything to the divine. And I mean, that if we begin to and we can definitely see this as an outcome of practicing the niyamas, as a matter of fact, the last of the niyamas is offer everything to the divine. We're not there yet, so we're still studying. Okay, now here's the answer to Robert Ayres's remarks. And I'm not saying he was wrong in what he's saying. This is just what Patanjali says. Wrong knowledge is knowledge which is false and not based upon the true nature of its object. Now, object is a very big word here. Doesn't mean just physical material objects. So I'll repeat that. And then we will take this up. This is where we'll start next week. Wrong knowledge is knowledge which is false and not based upon the true nature of its object. And it of course, as brought up earlier by Swayam, the rope snake is what's going to come up.
Brother Shankara,
Yes,
about
dear.
wrong knowledge, I read somewhere in a book that it said that there'd be a good example of a wrong knowledge would be like a barren woman giving birth to a child.
Yes, well, that will be brought up. That I think you may have read that in this book.
Okay.
Because the Swami will translate that out of Patanjali's. Yes, it is. That's if someone speaks about a barren woman giving birth to a child, this is a form of wrong knowledge. Anything else before we close? Please, this is just exactly what we should be doing. Let's not go ahead until all of your doubts and concerns about what's been said so far, or anything that you have to contribute from your own knowledge, as several of you have. Your own way of seeing this, which is perfectly valid from the perspective of the one sitting here. There is one, only one.
So we can pick this up next time, but I just want to go back to what Mark was saying about how do we know that we are, what is the right knowledge? And I keep reading the first sentence, which says, whatever our senses perceive is right knowledge. So perception for us today as a sadhak, maybe at some level, but our perception will hone in and become smarter or whatever, more acute, and it'll grow. So what is right knowledge today based on perception would be totally different when we are close to samadhi. So I think that perception factor is going to change and our right knowledge will be changing. But I guess whatever our perception is telling us is right knowledge.
Yes. And this is why, if you watch the movie Scrooge, particularly the one made by starring Alistair Sim, after Scrooge's transformation, he says to his clerk, I have not taken leave of my senses, Bob. I have come to them. In other words, he's seeing clearly because he's no longer the prisoner of fear and doubt. That's what happens. That's the core of his transformation, is that he's freed from fear and doubt. And so he says, I have not taken leave of my senses. I have come to them. And he sees clearly then what he should do, why he should do it, and his whole life is transformed. It's a beautiful story. It's one of the great parables of the fruits of wrong knowledge, fear and doubt, and their many, many cousins, and then freedom from that. That, of course,
Brother
comes.
Shankar,
Yes, dear.
I guess one way of looking at it is anything that keeps changing or anything we know about things that keep changing may not necessarily be wrong knowledge, but it's not the right knowledge either. I mean, for example, in medicine, I mean, what we thought was good several years ago is now proven to be not good, and it keeps changing all the time. At that time, we thought it was the right knowledge, but now it's wrong knowledge.
Yes.
So anything
Yes.
that keeps changing.
Yeah, you're no longer practicing medicine out of Galen's book, are you? So, yeah, exactly.
There's, these are all just words, of course, and the meanings change all the time. And but to me, and again, these are just words, but there's knowledge, and then there's truth. And as the Rig Veda says, truth is one. Sages call it by various names. And these different systems of knowledge and information is not that they have no use. They do. They're how we get there. But it's like I heard an expression recently that I hadn't heard, and it was interesting. It was moral holiday. And my friend was decluttering her house, and she said, I just get bogged down because I want to recycle everything. And I said, well, look, sometimes you just have to take about an hour moral holiday from recycling every scrap of paper. Just give yourself a moral holiday. You can take a holiday from, being a good person or knowing the right stuff, but you can't take a holiday from the truth.
No.
And we don't really know the truth because it's not knowledge, it's something else, something higher. Anyway, that's just thought.
I'm fixated on that knowledge term. I asked a few weeks ago about the ego being tied to the knowledge, and then I've been thinking about that too, that the ego is always involved in our knowledge, so it's not truth, I guess. So it's
well, the fact that we think of ourselves as having a separate ego is a form of wrong knowledge. But there's no way for us to assert that with anything like absolute certainty until we know that there is only one ahamkara, only one atman, only one ego sense. So in the meantime, we just do the best we can with what we've got, as Cindy was alluding to. And I'll just tell you a little joke, talking about right knowledge and wrong knowledge. Many of us know the name W.C. Fields. Now, W.C. Fields lived as a kind of a reprobate. He was a womanizer and a drinker and a this and a that and the other thing. At the end of his life, and he knew his days were numbered, he was bedridden, and his friend John Barrymore came to see him one day. And of course, his friends didn't call him W.C., they called him Bill. And Barrymore came into the room and found Fields reading the Bible, which was so uncharacteristic of him that Barrymore exclaimed, Bill, what in the world are you doing reading that book? And Fields said, looking for loopholes. I'm looking for loopholes. So he was looking for a kind of knowledge that would free him from his fear of death. So let us seek the kind of knowledge that will free us from whatever primal fears we have. Many of us are afraid of death. So until tomorrow morning, for those of you who decide to join us, the talk again will be Modern Masters of Advaita, Swami Vivekananda, Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta Maharaj, and David Bohm, BOHM. All right. Until then, oh, dearly beloved, a flower at your feet for each one who comes to your open door. A flower at your feet for each one who stands by your open door and says, come to me, offering to break this world's chain that binds us down to ignorance, suffering, and death. A flower at your feet for each one who takes the path that you have struck through this, your jungle world. Om Amen. Shanti, 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 peace, peace. Peace be unto us and to all beloved beings everywhere. Jai Shri Guru Maharaj Ji Ki Jai, Durga, Durga, Durga. May we be safe. May we be healthy. May we be cheerful. May we have peace of mind. And may we go forward in the loving and protective embrace of the Divine Being as our Mother and Father. So until tomorrow at 11, for those of you who are so inclined, thanks for coming. Thanks for having a wonderful class. Your contributions are so greatly treasured, and don't think that you have to speak up to make a contribution. There is something that happens in the collective unconscious that is very sustaining and uplifting from the energy of you being with us together. That's what it means to have the strength and skill to study together the art of spirituality. We are together. Until tomorrow.